I would like to, it is my great pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague, Jeff Phelps. Jeff is a research scientist at ETS, at the Understanding Teaching Quality Center. Jeff is, for those of you who've taken courses with me, you've probably read his stuff. Jeff was one of the, well, Jeff got his PhD at the University of Michigan and then stayed there as a researcher for a number of years until he moved over to ETS. Jeff worked with Deborah Ball very closely and Heather Hill in conceptualizing the whole idea of content knowledge for teaching. And he continued that work. He was worked with me as a co-PI on the med study to look at content knowledge for teaching. And he's been working over the years on issues around teacher knowledge and teacher skills. And so he's been engaged in some really interesting work that's going on at ETS now, where they're developing new models of assessment that have implications for licensure, but also, I think, for teacher education. And so I asked him to come here, and I think you're going to find this interesting from issues of both research and practice.
Okay. Thanks, Drew. Thank you all for coming on this cold, rainy day. So I would like this to be fairly informal. Please interrupt me at any point. I'm doing something a little different than I usually do. I tend to speak about a research study, share some empirical results, dig into some specific domain arguments around teaching or teacher content knowledge. But today I'm going to give a pretty high-level overview and actually share some examples of some tasks for a new assessment system that we're developing at ETS. Really, any part of this, any example or even an overview of licensure and associated issues around teaching quality could take up this whole time. So I am going to skip along at a pretty high level, but what I'm hoping is at the end we'll have enough time left. I'll try to police myself and make sure that questions don't get too much in the weeds. So we have some time for discussion. I put up here that we're going to focus on implications for teacher preparation. It's a little selfish. I'm a teacher educator. My interest in licensure is as a vehicle to support teacher development. I really don't see our problem in this country of selecting smarter people to go into the classroom. Great to have smart people, but I think there are things that are critical for beginning teachers to learn, and we need a variety of mechanisms to help guide that work. And so my interest in licensure really comes from that perspective. So I would love to hear your thoughts on implications for teacher preparation, but we can also talk about other things that come up during the presentation. All right, so I'm going to start with this first bullet and just a couple of very high-level comments about teacher licensure tests. One thing I think that is really important to recognize about licensure tests is that by definition they always focus on just some aspects of the variety of competencies that we want teachers to bring to the classroom. And there are different kinds of licensure tests. So I'm sort of really talking about initial licensure here. So here we're talking about initial competencies for teaching. And there are a wide range of things that you might want teachers to know about that I'm not going to touch on at all today. Things that have to do with skills and capacities for engaging in collegial interactions, ethical issues around teaching, legal issues around teaching. There's many things that teachers do that aren't around the core work of instruction. So one of the key things that you do in any argument about a licensure test is bear down on some set of competencies that you think you can assess and that actually matter. And you recognize that there are other mechanisms for certifying, if you will, other competencies. I've listed a couple up there. There are simple things like, for many professions, you need to have attained a certain level in school in order to begin your professional preparation. There's all kinds of things that happen around degree programs, getting your degree in a professional program, and all of the accreditation mechanisms that back that up. So, Rutgers has to conform to a whole series of New Jersey accreditation requirements. And then there's a whole variety of ways that teachers, well, professionals here, I guess I'm up above teachers, engage in aspects of their professional work through residencies, internships, structured, on-site learning opportunities, and so forth. Often initial licensure is focused on basic competencies. That's certainly been the case with teachers, but it's also the case in areas like medicine, where there is a sort of basic knowledge base. Either it's content or it's things about biology that you are expected to know. But increasingly, a lot of licensure tests are trying to assess aspects of professional practice. So they're actually concerned when a professional leaves the environment of their professional preparation and the halls of their university, what they're actually able to do on-site in their professional work. And there's some very good examples of this. In medicine, there's a thing called the standardized patient exam, where as a doctor, you go into a room and you sit down with an actor. It's a simulation, and you have to diagnose them. And the assessment is your ability to diagnose that patient, and you go through a series of these. They're for pilots, flight simulations. That's an interesting example of how exams are put together, because those flight simulations obviously focus on things like taking off, but they also are concerned that once the pilot's in the air, they're able to hit the ground again without crashing. So they often include combinations of simulations, and you have to make decisions about that in licensure, right? If you're going to simulate something like flight, is it just taking off that you do, or is it also necessary to know how to land that plane? So that's sort of an extreme example, but you can think of analogies in teaching where you might care about ensuring the combinations of things are assessed. So there are these assessments of professional practice. So in teaching, there are some common examples of this. Probably the longest tradition in teaching are content exams of various sorts. So there are subject matter exams. If you're going to teach math, do you actually know the math that you're going to be responsible for teaching? But under those knowledge exams also fall other kinds of things that teachers are asked. So general principles of teaching and learning. Do you know things about how kids develop as readers? Not necessarily related to the content of language or text, but things that have to do with the psychology of development of students and so forth. So a series of content exams, oops, I skipped a bullet, general principles of teaching and learning. Increasingly, portfolios are being used as an assessment mechanism. The really first widespread example of portfolios wasn't for initial licensure, it was through the national boards, but now there are a variety of assessment programs like EdTPA, which is not an ETS product, if you will, it's a Pearson product, is the most widespread example. And for portfolios, what you're asked to do often is submit a video of your teaching, submit work samples, and those are later scored by humans who sit down and apply some criteria about the sufficiency of what you've done. Closer to practice, but not yet a simulation, so I'll be saying a lot more about that as we go forward. So a variety of things to say about these different exams. They've read as sort of their limitations. Of course, they have affordances as well. The content knowledge tests are wonderful because they are cheap, they're scalable, so that they can be used across many sites, on wide populations without running into sort of expense issues. But there are limitations as well. My real area of work, and I'm glad to talk about it more later if anybody's interested, is the way in which straight content knowledge isn't really fully sufficient for teaching a subject. Another issue with these content knowledge tests is even though you need to know math, they're often disconnected from how teachers actually use that mathematics in their teaching practice. Right? So they're not designed in ways that assess the professional work of applying knowledge to the problems you encounter in your work. Much the same thing can be said about these general principles. Often they're too general to be really applicable to anything. Right? These very, almost rule of thumb kind of generalities. And they're often also disconnected from practice. Right? So they will ask you questions about student development, which is good for a teacher to know about, but how you actually use that knowledge in your teaching with students, there can be a huge gap between those two. So portfolios have a whole lot of issues associated with them. One of them is that candidates get to select the submissions to their portfolio. So in many ways they're gameable. Right? You can figure out ways to select things that will essentially be easier to get a good score on. One of the big arguments is they're not fair. So Drew and Courtney Bell wrote a very interesting paper talking about observations of teaching quality, and one of their big arguments is that teaching quality is actually constructed out of a lot of different inputs, if you will. It's not something that just teachers do, right? It's actually something that students contribute to, that's influenced by the environment that you're teaching in, the curriculum materials. And so one of the big concerns, if you want to make a claim about a teacher, is how to separate out the information that's really about them, that's unique to them, from all of the other things that influence the quality of the teaching that actually gets enacted in real classrooms with real students in real environments. And portfolios are much the same thing, right? You buy all the things that come along with your environment. So as a prospective teacher, one of the big reasons these might not be fair is you likely have to do this in the classroom of your cooperating teacher. And for anybody who's been out into classrooms of cooperating teachers, you know that they are highly variable, and what students are actually allowed to do is highly variable. It's one of the big challenges of teacher ed programs, making sure that placements are high quality for students. But so that gets to be part of what is actually observed, as well as all the things that students are bringing to the classroom. So if it's easier to produce a high quality lesson with kids who come from high, socioeconomic backgrounds than kids from poor neighborhoods, or in classrooms where there's low mobility, student mobility, compared to ones where there's high student mobility, then those features of teaching that get brought in by students are going to be reflected in your portfolio as well. Well, one way to think about this fairness issue is there's no real standardization. Okay, and just in all fairness, I've sort of set this up that makes all of these look like there's bad things associated with them. I just want to be really clear. I'm about to share a new set of ideas that we're developing, and there are critiques of these methods as well. We'll talk about some of those near the end of the session, but I think what's really important to take from this is that all of these methods of gathering information on prospective teachers that can go into licensure tests have some affordances and some disadvantages. You get some information and not other information. And to be really informed about this, tracking on that is really important. So here's just a couple of additional considerations. I really, I touched on a couple of these. This problem of identifying competencies is a huge one, right? There is no agreement over what teachers need to know and be able to do to be an effective teacher. In fact, there's a lot of disagreement. So trying to come to some kind of consensus on that across multiple contexts is a challenge and a big one for this general project. I haven't even really touched on all the things that go into ensuring that any assessment is valid and fair, that the things that you say from scores actually provide the kind of information you want to make a judgment about a candidate. There's a whole, well, we could spend the rest of our time talking about just that bullet, but there are a whole lot of considerations there as well. I don't remember what I was going to say about the third bullet. So I'll go by. Maybe I'll come back to that bullet later. Okay, so let me dive into NOTE with that sort of overview. So a couple things to know about NOTE. This is an entirely new licensure exam that's being developed by ETS. We're developing this in collaboration with Teaching Works at the University of Michigan. So Deborah Ball and Francesca Forzani and a whole group there have been working for a long time on trying to identify the kinds of practices that are really critical for beginning teachers to be able to carry out, to be let loose in a classroom. They call these high leverage practices. And they're trying to figure out how to develop programs that ensure that teachers can actually go out and conduct these practices. And so you'll see those reflected in the tasks in a minute. But this is a partnership, and there's a whole cast of characters at ETS working on this as well. So I'm representing here the work of a lot of people. There are two major components to this assessment. I'm going to share examples from each. Content knowledge for teaching. We're focusing on types of knowledge that we argue are specialized to the work of teaching. And by that I mean that only teachers need to use this knowledge in this particular way in teaching practice. An accountant wouldn't have to use math in this particular way. A copy editor wouldn't have to use their knowledge about language arts in this particular way. It's unique to the work of teaching. And also, we are focusing on developing these new assessments around high leverage practices that come from teaching works. This is really the most different, I guess, component of the note assessment. I'm going to show an example of this in a minute as well. So, I mean, here's just a couple bullets about what is unique about Note. I guess I can't really underemphasize the first bullet, that we're focusing on teaching practice. It's easy to take that sort of almost glibly and say, of course, you're going to focus on teaching practice. You are talking about teaching after all. It's something that individuals have to learn how to do. But historically, research on schooling and teachers often hasn't really focused much on teaching, and certainly licensure hasn't focused much on teaching. The starting point of licensure, for example, has often been subject matter. So people have started with math, and they've brought in mathematicians to decide what teachers need to know. Our focus is really working from the other direction, saying, given the things that teachers need to do in teaching math, what are the competencies and knowledge that are involved that we want to assess? Of course, it involves math, but the focus is on teaching practice. And I've already said these other things. Okay, so a quick overview of Note. Note has two major components. There's the content knowledge for teaching test. Right now, we're focusing just on elementary education, and we're focusing just on the subtests in mathematics and ELA. We have started work on science, and God help us, we've also started work on social studies. Social studies has a lot of complications, including figuring out what in the world it actually is. But you know, though we see those as the four key subject areas. I think one thing to notice is that in this assessment, we are focusing on content aspects of teaching. And the same is true for the performance assessment. So the performance assessments also focus on content teaching. There's one assessment that focuses on your ability to model and explain content. These are the kinds of things that you might do if you're modeling for students in math, how to go about solving a mathematical problem, you know, applying an algorithm, or in ELA if you're modeling a certain set of comprehension strategies. I sometimes call this air teaching, not because students don't matter, but because what's really being focused on is the teacher's performance of these these models and explanations for students. There's no real student-teacher interaction implied by the modeling and explaining content assessment. Leading the classroom discussion. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but I'm going to share an example in a moment. And eliciting student thinking. The eliciting student thinking task, what you are asked to do is actually interact with a student and around a piece of content, and the task is for you to interact in ways that inform you about the student's understanding of this task. So that when you are done, you know something about why they did something, maybe why they misunderstood it, and what they understand from the content features of the work. Not an easy thing to do, right, at all, actually. An easy thing to do. You need to know a lot about the content, and you need to know a lot about how to organize your questioning and follow up with students so that you learn something about how they understand the content. So these are the three big tasks. There are three of the Michigan high leverage practices. Michigan has, it keeps changing. I think there's 19 high leverage practices now that they're focusing on. And we are assessing 3 that we have decided are particularly critical, so they're the highest of the high leverage for initial practice. Okay, so here we start to get into the assessment methods, I guess. And one thing I want to really point out here, and this isn't by accident, these are the actual performances we care about, right? They're sort of as illustrated, right? The actual work of modeling or leading a discussion or eliciting student thinking. When we get to the assessment tasks, we are giving tasks for participants to carry out that we think will provide some information that's relevant to their ability to carry out the work. A lot of times people will evaluate these kinds of tasks along lines like authenticity. And authenticity matters. It matters that things are believable. But what really matters is that you're collecting information that's valid and relevant to the performances that you want people to carry out. So these are tasks. They get some things and not other things. The modeling and explaining content, you're not doing exactly what a teacher might often do, which is standing at a blackboard. You're sitting down and working in a virtual space on a laptop. The leading the classroom discussion, I'm going to say a lot more about this one in a moment. You're actually working in a virtual environment with students to coordinate their discussion around a topic. And the eliciting student thinking is the same thing. You're eliciting thinking with, in this virtual environment. So these are the 3 assessments. I'm just going to go right down through these. A few features of each one. I really touched on these. Let me see if there's any that I want to really draw out. I guess that what is worth noting about this is that in the modeling, there is a lot of attention given to how teachers think out loud and narrate thought processes. So if you think about the work of teaching and modeling, in contrast, for example, how a mathematician might model a problem for students where they might just go through and show them how they do it, and how a teacher might model those processes where they actually help them understand why they do some things and not others, right? They sort of unpack the mathematics and the work at the same time. That's a big part of the modeling. And eliciting really has 2 major components that we're focusing on. Your ability to pose relevant questions, right, so that the student actually is being prompted to provide relevant information, and your ability to analyze their responses. And then let me go on. I think the next one, the next one is the example. Okay, so I'm going to really focus in here on the leading classroom discussion. And the first thing I need to say something about is the immersion simulated environment. We're collaborating with a group called Immersion. There's another name to their group too that I'm blanking on. They're in Florida, Central Florida University, I think. But they've developed this environment, which is a virtual environment. It is not artificial intelligence, right? So the way to think about this is it's sort of like an old style marionette stage where there's one person operating multiple marionettes, but you can't see them. In this case, there is a person that's actually driving these avatars. And in terms of the classroom discussion, there's one person driving all 5. So they're sort of like a virtual puppeteer. Right? They can hear what the teacher is saying, or the candidate, or the subject, whatever you want to call the person who's actually taking the test, doing the task. They can hear what they're saying, it's getting transmitted to them in Florida, and then they are responding through these avatars. And so one of the big advantages of this environment is it removes all of what testers would call construct irrelevant variance. That's just things that students might bring to the assessment that you wouldn't want to assess. Variation in students that might make the task really different from one person to another and make it unfair. So it's a way of standardizing and controlling the actual assessment task. It comes with costs as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But that's the basic vehicle. Okay, so a little bit more about leading a whole class discussion. This is the actual HLP, or high leverage practice, from the TeachingWorks website. We have since managed to make them change it a little bit. The word whole has gotten dropped. My background is in English language arts, and I objected to that right off the bat because I certainly didn't conduct whole class discussions nearly as much in ELA. I did in math quite a bit, but not in ELA. And so there's a sort of math-centricness sometimes to these HLPs, which we're trying to have some influence on. So in a whole class discussion, the teacher and all of the students work on specific content together, using one another's ideas as resources. The purposes of a discussion are to build collective knowledge and capability in relation to specific instructional goals and to allow students to practice listening, speaking, and interpreting. In instructionally productive discussions, the teacher and a wide range of students contribute orally, listen actively, and respond to and learn from others' contributions. So that's the HLP. That's what they're trying to prepare students to do. We are assessing parts of that. You'll see as we go forward how we're still clearly on class discussion, but there's some pieces of what I just read that aren't included in this task. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of a video from a first grade task in English language arts. You can see some of what the candidate's being asked to do here. They're going to facilitate a discussion specifically to help their students make inferences. They want to elicit thinking from all the students, so they want to involve all the students in the discussion. Coordination of ideas that are being proposed so that they're not all just serial IRE kind of interactions, where there's actually some building and response to different ideas. There are some content issues here, so they actually have to show that they can represent the content accurately, so they would get penalized for content errors in this kind of task, and that they can bring the discussion to a conclusion. This particular task, they're being sort of dropped into the middle of a series of lessons, so they're told that the students have already read this book by Ezra Jack Keats, and that now they've got a particular piece of work they're going to do with the students around this book. And let me just say a little bit about this book, Pet Show. So this is a picture book, a short picture book. These are supposed to be, I think, first grade. You'll see that our avatars don't really look yet like first graders, so we're building new avatars. And I think some of the discussion doesn't feel like first grade discussions. Anybody hear a taught first grade reading? Yes, that was I taught primary grade reading. Some of the ways that the students are interacting feels an awful lot more like sixth graders to me than first graders. So we're working on those kinds of issues. But this is a first grade task. The kids in this book are maybe second or third graders. And the book is about, there's this pet show competition. And all the kids are bringing their pets. And the boy, I can't remember his name, wants to bring his cat to the pet show. And when he goes to get his cat, he can't find the cat. It's just disappeared. And so he ends up going to the pet show where all of his friends have brought their pets, and everybody gets an award. It's not really a competition, cutest pet, slowest pet, et cetera. But he doesn't have his cat, and so he shows up with a glass jar that has nothing in it, and he says, I brought my germ. This is my pet, germ. And in the middle of doing this, an old lady shows up with his cat and is awarded, cutest pet in the show award or something. And he doesn't say anything about it, but she comes up to him later and says, if this was your cat, wasn't it? And he says, yes, it was. But the ribbon you got looks so nice on you, you can keep it. There's more to the story, but that's the general overview. So the kids have already read this. The candidate is given this book, and they're dropped into a preparation period of about 30 minutes. I've pulled out a couple of pieces from the preparation materials, but there's more to what they're given. And they're told what they'll be assessed on. You can see those 4 bullets. And I just want you to pay attention to those, because when we watch this video, I want you to think about whether you're getting information that might allow you to make judgments on these aspects. They're told what the learning goal is. And they're also given the initial prompt. That's what launches the assessment, and that was deliberate. The goal in this assessment wasn't to see whether the candidates could pick a good initial question, but once a good initial question was asked, whether they could manage the discussion from that point forward, right? So you can see that even here, a lot of decisions have been made about how to bound this discussion, right, in this task. All right, so I'm going to drop you into the merging environment, and I'm going to show a clip. I probably won't show the whole performance here due to time, but I want to give you a flavor of how this actually works. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing the person who's taking the assessment. They're sitting at a computer, and you're seeing what she sees, right? Which are the avatars and a workspace where she's able to write things down as if she were, presenting to the students. However she wants to organize that. Any questions before I show this? Yeah.
So, the candidate allowed to use internet to search some information to
No.
prepare?
No, so they're actually in a test center. So it's a controlled environment. They're given a certain amount of time, and they do not know what the task is before they show up, right? So they don't. So in that sense, it's an on-demand assessment task, like a lot of test items. You know that you might be asked something around early grade reading, but you don't know what you're going to be asked to do. Oh, sorry.
Do they have to use? Do they get to read the pet show book?
Yes. Yeah, I'm just not showing it to you, but
That's
they
fine.
do.
Can they like rearrange the chair so this is
No.
appropriate?
No, so this is set, and these kids are set, and they're this way all the time. There are some changes that are happening here. I'm not as familiar with this task as other parts of the assessment. So there's work that's been going on around this through a variety of clouding, and changes are being made based on a variety of things, candidates' comments, and so forth.
And is the workspace, for lack of a better word, a blackboard so that the avatar actor can see it?
The avatar actor can see it, right? So it's actually a tablet they're working on. The avatar actor has a tablet. I kind of imagine it like the Wizard of Oz with like levers all over the place. I don't know what they're operating on the other side because they're doing all the voices and all the movements, and I don't know.
And they can use it as a blackboard.
Canada uses that workspace there.
As a blackboard.
That's
Right, that's the idea. All right. So let's have a look.
Yeah. You need a weed teacher.
Yes.
I thought he was really sweet.
You thought he was sweet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what made you think he was sweet? Do you have, what kind of evidence can you show us? What page number did you see that on?
Okay, well, so pages, like, one thing, like, right at the end,
Okay.
like, on the last page, like, when he was being really nice to the lady, like,
Yes.
he was, like, really sweet to the lady.
Yes, he was. Is there anyone who'd like to add on to that? Yes, Ed.
Yeah, well, also because when the lady, when she had the cat at the pet show, Archie didn't get mad or anything. He was really nice about it.
Okay, so far it's nice and nice. Would you say that he is?
It's super sweet.
Okay, super sweet. Okay. And Ed, was there a different page that you had that evidence from?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
What page was that?
Well, it was like page, I can't remember the page number, but it's when the lady shows up with the cat and she gets a blue ribbon.
Okay, so
Yeah.
he didn't get upset over that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Sean, I saw you had your hand up before. Was there anything else you'd like to add?
Yes, he was also a really good friend.
Good friend.
Mm-hmm.
And where was it in the story that showed you he was a good friend?
Well, he was a good friend a lot.
But like one of the times he was a good friend was like in the beginning, because he was like telling the people, like telling all his friends, he told them to go ahead without him.
Yes, that's true. He did tell them to go ahead without him.
Yeah.
Okay. Kevin, would you like to add on to anything?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I thought Archie he was kind of sneaky though. Like he wasn't really, he didn't tell the truth.
Oh, what made you think he was sneaky?
Cause he like made stuff up.
What exactly did he make up?
Oh, well, like when he brought the germ, like that's not a real thing.
Oh, actually, germs are real things.
Oh. Well, I mean, yeah, germs are real, but they're not a pet.
That's true. They are not pets.
No.
He was just looking for something to make up while his cat was with the other lady.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Maria, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I thought that was good thinking.
What part was good thinking?
Well, that he thought of a way to still be in the pet show, even though he couldn't find his cat.
Yes, so he's a good thinker. And
Got my eye on the clock, so I'm going to stop it here. I'm also going to ask you to just hold your questions until the end, because I'm sure that brings up lots of things, like how the students are characterized, maybe essentialized, right? What you're actually able to learn from that performance, some measurement issues, like how in the world do you standardize an interaction like that so that everybody gets the same kind of responses, and so forth. So we can talk about some of those afterwards. I want to make sure to have time to share the other tasks. So let me just charge ahead quickly. Some strengths that we've noticed. One is that we really do think that we're focusing on practice. And by that I mean the ability to do something that a teacher has to do in ways that other assessments really have not. The suspension of disbelief actually comes from our candidates who are taking this. That we've heard universally that once you get in this environment, it really feels surprisingly realistic. I've done a few myself, and I can attest to that. It is really kind of amazing. The potential to standardize. There's kind of a slickness about it that, well, I'm not sure I would call that a strength, and maybe it's a marketing strength, I don't know. Candidates certainly like it. I also, as a teacher educator, think that there's lots of potentials for a technology like this to be used in teacher education. So we're kind of talking about licensure tests, but there are many other ways formatively that tasks like this could be used that have some exciting potential. There's some real limitations. This is really technically hard to pull off. There are issues with authenticity when you start to standardize. That can make some of the interactions feel maybe a little stilted in ways. The interactors that are driving the avatars, more than you might like, say things like, I don't know, because they've hit a place where there's nowhere for them to sort of go, given the standardization, stuff like that. It's expensive, right? So you start to develop assessments like this, they take longer, they've got a lot more development costs, and all of a sudden the cost of a license, taking the license test starts to go up, which has real implications. There are a lot of puzzles to pulling this off. The interactors, this system's been around for a while. It was designed for prospective teachers to practice management, and they hired actors, so they're sort of improvising. But as soon as you want them to start to standardize and start to be more realistic and to drive multiple students at the same time, there are all kinds of issues with cognitive load. This is really hard work. And many of them don't have the content knowledge to do this well. They don't understand the content space. Getting the task sort of at the right size. Is it okay to drop somebody in the middle of a lesson? Right? You're not assessing all the things that go before. Does that work? And this issue of standardization comes up again and again. It's a strength. It's something we're aiming for, but it comes at a cost. All right, so let me go through my examples of CKT stuff fairly quickly. This is actually a pleasure for me because usually I spend the most time on these things, but I'm going to go through really fast. I already said a little bit about what it is. I think the most important thing to recognize is that advances in thinking about teacher content knowledge as conceptualization have suggested, and I would say we're really at the point that we're starting to go past suggestion, where we have really strong evidence that teachers draw on a variety of different kinds of content knowledge. It goes beyond just knowing the subject or knowing the content students are learning. Knowledge that's specialized to their work, knowledge that is what's often called pedagogical content knowledge. It involves knowing something about students and how they respond, or the advantages and disadvantages of different kinds of representations. We're focusing most intently on specialized content knowledge in our assessment. And one of the things that drives this, an initial step, is a modeling of the instructional domain, the work of teaching, if you will, because our focus again is on practice. It's on the content problems that you encounter when you're doing the work that teachers do with content. So things in mathematics like comparing explanations for a variety of purposes, or creating mathematical definitions. And if you're a first grade teacher, you don't want to use the definition for negative numbers or even numbers that you might have learned later on in school. You need to think about definitions that work at grade level, and so forth. And there's many, many aspects of teaching that involve content, where you use content knowledge in ways that only teachers have to use it. So to give you a quick example of how this looks, I put a contrast example up here, which is just a simple algebra problem. This is the kind of stuff that is on many licensure tests. You have to know this if you're going to teach basic algebra, right? You're not even in a position to know whether students have gotten it right if you can't do this math yourself. Right? So you would need to be able to work this through and know that the correct answer is double. But really, you're just being asked, can you do the math that your students are doing? That's all that's being assessed here. With content knowledge for teaching questions, we're situating the questions in the kind of content problems that teachers encounter. So this is an example from the note assessment. There's a teacher here, and her students are being asked from a textbook to critique two methods to determine if they're valid. I'll just tell you quickly that they are in fact not valid, right? But you have to understand first what is going on, or if you will, what a student might have done in order to do this work that is not valid. And you would have to be able to understand for this question what this kind of error, if you will, would show you about a student's understanding. So a couple things to say about this. This is a kind of work that only teachers do. Nobody else has to judge math that's wrong, right, for whether it is valid or not, or what it's showing you. There's some stuff going on in here that is valid, right? Whoever did these problems actually knows how to do things like understand the use of inverse operations, right? They're actually doing that correctly. But you have to understand here what it is that in fact tripped this student up, if you will. The other thing to say about this is knowing math really helps. I'm sure that there's some people in this room who haven't had to do this kind of activity with math before, but you were able to get an answer. That's fine. The point is that we are assessing knowledge as it's used in teaching. In some cases, knowing a lot of math is in fact helpful. You can work through them. In a way, that's kind of an easier task. We have other tasks where knowing a lot of math isn't nearly as helpful. It's much more perplexing what's going on. But this gives you a general sort of sense when we say that we're developing assessment questions that are assessing how teachers apply their knowledge in practice, what we mean by that, and in particular what we mean when we're talking about specialized content knowledge. And the other thing to say about this is that we have pretty strong evidence, I think, from other studies that for these kinds of problems, you can know the math. Many people can do this, and you'd think because they can do that, they would also be able to do this. not the case. They really get tripped up when they're asked to do math in new and different ways. And Eugenia?
Why is it not the third bullet? Why
So,
is it,
sorry, Eugenia, what?
why is it not the third? Understanding the use of properties of
Well,
operations.
you don't really have to use any mathematical properties to solve this problem. Like, so what were you thinking of as how many math people do we have in the room here teaching? So.
Yeah, but if you wrongly simplify 2x plus 3, you get 5x. Isn't
Yeah,
it
but so-
wrongly simplifying?
So, almost universally in math, but this is a test design problem as well. When
Mhm.
people talk about properties, they're talking about things like associative property, commutative property, and there are no use of traditional properties in this problem. In fact, well,
Okay.
those of you who have taught math at this grade, challenge me if you think I'm wrong about that. Do you see a property being used in this example? So, but I think the other thing this illustrates is that we're assessing other things here too, right? So you actually need to know math at this level to know what is meant by properties, and you could debate whether we should be doing that or not, right? We could have put on the end of this e.g. associative, commutative, right? So we could have actually told people that. So it's all kinds of decisions like that go into assessment design. All right, so let me just wrap up quickly because I'm over time. I have an ELA example. I'm actually not going to share it, but I just want to show you some of the practices that we've identified that we think are ways that you use knowledge about language, language development, text in teaching ELA. We have an example that's actually pulled from Praxis. This is sort of it's general knowledge of literacy development. So this is an example of the kinds of things that are assessed under things like principles of teaching and learning. And here's the example from early reading where you're being asked to figure out what is going on with a student when they misread a word. Like what kinds of things they're paying attention to in the text. Meaning, syntax, graphophonetic, letter sound relationships. So this is a sort of specialized skill of early reading where you have to make sense of kids misreading. It tells you a lot about what they are able to do in the areas that they need work. All right, so a couple strengths and limitations. Again, one of the strengths of this approach is that we're actually tying our assessment directly to teaching. So in areas like math, where mathematicians often come in and say, you should put this math on the test, our response would be, well, show me where that shows up in teaching. And if you can't, it doesn't belong. And when you assess knowledge, show me how you're using it in teaching so that we can assess it in that way. We think these assessments are much more comprehensive. They assess areas of knowledge that haven't been assessed before. We also think that there's space here for this kind of work to be used in teacher preparation, in formative ways. But there are challenges as well. They're hard to develop. The domain is shockingly large when you start to cross all of these tasks of teaching with all the topic areas that teachers work in. You start to realize that there are lots of places that they use content knowledge around content problems that come up in teaching. They have a fairly high cost associated with them, and sometimes there's authenticity issues. So we have some of the same challenges that we're encountering with yearly practice-based assessments. And just skip over the electrical puzzles. Okay, so this is just a quick illustration, a quick list of some of the things that we're doing to roll out this assessment. We have done a series of tryouts. We have more planned. We have a big pilot going on now. And our goal is actually fairly ambitious in rolling these out, that we want, I'm taking a deep sigh because I'm responsible in part for this one, making sure that the CKT tests are ready to go operational basically less than a year from now. And there's a lot to do. Performance assessments, which are collectively called practices of teaching content, are on a slightly slower schedule. Okay, so I can go back to any of those things I skipped if anybody's interested. I put up a couple of extra discussion questions, and I just think I should open it up to you and see what you are curious about, both in terms of what it is we're trying to assess, how we're doing it, whether we are making advances over other kinds of licensure tests. But then here's my baby. I'd love to hear what you think about how this could support all of you who are involved in teacher education.
So first, thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
Questions? Comments?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the video you just show us because it is very creative format of testing. But how can you evaluate or score the candidate's performance? Do you use human evaluation or automated evaluation?
No, there's no automation. We're thinking about automation, but right now it'll be scored by humans. There's a scoring rubric, and most of the scoring domains for the one that you saw are about the ways in which you interact with students and coordinate the discussion. But for those of you who are measurement people in the room, you'll recognize that, so all human scored assessments of all kinds have this problem of getting human scores to score things in the same way, right? So they're reliably scoring, and that you never fully succeed. There's always some irregularity or variance in human scoring. And sometimes it's biased, which becomes a real problem, right? Where they notice certain things for certain subpopulations, and your scores end up disadvantaging certain groups. We've added a whole other layer onto that here. So in addition to having all the human scoring, we also have this problem of variance that can be introduced by these interactors and how they drive these avatars. And we don't really understand yet the implications of that for measurement. Although, let me just say that none of the implications are likely to be good, right? This is a real problem because we've got two different things that are hard to standardize here. And so we don't, and what it ends up, the ultimate problem is whether you have a lot of error in your assessment, and in particular whether it's biased, right? So you happen to see the interactor in this one, and we're not going to show the interactor because we think that there might be bias that gets introduced by race of candidates. We'll see. That's why we're doing all these pilots. But this is a big challenge, right? So the scoring has multiple implications.
So Jeff, what does the interactor get in terms of information or sort of permissible moves they can make in response to different kinds of things
Right.
the teacher says?
So they get a couple things. So each student has a different profile. So there's a student who talks too much and interrupts, which is one thing you have to manage. There's a student who is reticent to share anything, which is another thing you have to manage. There's other profiles as well. So they get that, right? But they also get that over the course of the interaction, the student has to present some things, and for want of a better term, I'll call them productive responses, and other responses that are sort of off. So I didn't go far enough along to share an off one, but one of the students shared something that actually wasn't related at all to the story. And it's just completely unrelated. And so they get guidelines on how much of each of those things they're supposed to do. The sort of cop-out answer is we're still trying to figure that out. And I don't really know the details because I'm not deeply involved in those decisions. But those sort of profiles of actual students and parameters around the actual task are a big part of each one of these tasks, which of course candidates never see. Right? So this is all, if you will, sort of part of the task development. And we're trying to figure them out still. We don't really know exactly how to do this. And I think there's a question mark to what extent we can really standardize. We have to do some testing. So I guess that's what ETS does. But we have to study this stuff. Yeah.
I was at AACTE this year, and they were demonstrating this, so I was in the room when they did it. And you know, it's a very strange thing to participate in, and I think that, you know, if you're a good gamer, you might also be good at this sort of thing. There might be a connection there. But I have to say, it really saddens me when I think about these sort of things getting created and the amount of money. I understand the need to standardize and to be able to assess, but when I think of what we pay our cooperating teachers who are like apprenticing these students, and we should be investing more in that. So it's just a personal opinion, but it's difficult to see the enormous investment in all of this.
So I guess my response to that, so I certainly don't disagree with what you're saying. It is an enormous investment, and there are concerns over whether we're really assessing the competencies that matter most, or things that are irrelevant, right? I think that we need to lay out the pros and cons of all kinds of different experiences for teachers. So my background with teacher educators was at the University of Michigan. And even though we have high minority populations all around us, it was really hard to get our cooperating teachers, our students into cooperating teachers' classrooms where there were high proportions of minority students, or where the teacher was a minority teacher. And so these methods allow you to think about systematically introducing teachers to situations that they might never encounter in a regular teacher ed program, or to assess a variation of experiences. Imperfectly, right? Right. So there's trade-offs.
Yeah, I know one of the avatars was, when I was there, was the ESL student in the classroom.
Yeah.
But then that also brings up a lot of questions about who's the interactor, did you call it? Like, do they know about second language acquisition? What would be, you know, the language that would be performed in the class, or were they just told the person to be quiet? So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, you know, so there's a series of questions. Should these kinds of things be assessed? How can we assess them? Do you get that information from portfolios or not? Is it responsible for us to locate, you know, kids, prospective teachers out into classrooms when we don't have some evidence that they can actually do things that we think, you know, if you can't lead a classroom discussion or figure out what your student understands, it's really irresponsible to send somebody out into a classroom and hope they'll learn it on the job. Right? You know, so there's a bunch of things to be sort of reconciled here, and I really think that the conversations that should go on are pros and cons. I worry about some of the people that are interested in this. It's sort of it's the coolest thing since sliced bread phenomenon, and it's not. It's got some advantages and disadvantages, and those have to be weighed carefully. You have to understand carefully what you're getting information on.
I think there's a really nice opportunity for the science, because you have students who are generating misconceptions in real time, and you don't want the teacher to just allow them to go rogue. I mean, some people might say, if you're a radical constructionist, that you want them to go rogue, or you will allow them to go rogue. But you know, the teacher's content knowledge and how they then tie the students' preconceptions or alternative frameworks to the scientifically accepted views would be a really nice content-oriented piece around teacher practices for science that I think are particularly important.
Right. And so the problem raises its head very quickly about which things you focus on again, right? So this issue of selecting out the stuff that will actually be the content of the assessments is huge. And so I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just pointing out that yes, and I'm sure almost everybody in this room could think of something else that might be good to try to model in these tests, that you would like your students to have opportunities to practice and be confronted with sort of real time. And so another big piece of this is figuring out, is that what we want to do or not? I happen to agree with you. I think having tasks built around content conceptions, I'm going to broaden it from misconceptions, just conceptions, and have teachers have to understand those real time is critical.
I'm wondering, there's a lot of work in teacher education around video clubs, and each of us teachers work with videos and also artifacts. But I'm wondering if you thought at all, DPS has thought at all about what would be the advantages and disadvantages instead of, or on top of the real-time interactions, which requires your interactors and quite a lot of sophistication on part of those interactors, rather than having some, having pre-service teachers critique some piece of instruction that might even be actors, I don't know, but that has particular things in it that you want them to notice and see whether they're noticing them and what would they do, even if it's not, so you take the real time out of it, and I know you lose a lot by taking the real time out of it, but it is also somewhat simpler to manage and maybe a good way to triangulate some of what you're getting.
I think you get something different, right? So you either get information or you provide opportunities for somebody to learn how to analyze practice, which is, when you say this, you mean like viewing the video club videos?
Viewing the video, viewing what kids are saying, and then being able to say, well, if I was in this, first of all, what am I seeing? Forget what the teacher does, right? Like, just what are the kids saying? What are they thinking?
Right.
And then think about, well, what move would you make as a teacher?
I think it's a great idea. So, for example, those of you who are math people probably know about cognitively guided instruction. And they've done lots of work of this kind where they've shown students doing math. And the intervention for teachers, the professional development, is around analysis. And there's strong evidence that that's associated with effectiveness in the classroom. So I think that there's all kinds of good reasons to have teachers analyze video. I would just say that there's...
Jeff, you could even put the teacher education students in the role of scorers, essentially, but stop at particular points.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
There's all kinds of ways this could be used. I just would point out that there's something different about analyzing practice. So from my own teacher ed background, I did early reading instruction, and we looked at good read-alouds, and students got really good at telling what was good and bad about read-alouds, but then you would sit them down with the book and have them do it. They couldn't even figure out how to hold the book, right? So there's lots of stuff in the work of executing a practice that really matters, that goes beyond that. I think that they are both important parts of a larger set of competencies that we want teachers to develop.
One more.
So this is all done for discussions, or a teacher can see what they're writing. Can these avatars write, or they only can talk? Because in high school, talk is not, it's not as much as writing, all kinds of stuff.
I'm almost sure I'm right in what I'm about to say. I don't think they can write. I know that that's been on the table. There are many things that have been on the table, including more functionality for the avatars to talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
So right now, because one person's driving the avatars, and something about the setup of the room, you get this sort of,
But if you can just rearrange the room and you give them this opportunity to rearrange, and you will see how they rearrange the room, that would tell you a lot.
And I'm pretty sure that for whatever reasons, where we've ended up is no, they're not writing, and no, the room is not rearranged. I don't think there's anything fixed about that decision. I'm sure there's, it's ETS after all, so cost gets involved, it's going to re-engineer stuff, and there could be other measurement issues. I can't remember. But I think the general idea could certainly be set up in different ways.
Because you teach them to have collaborative environment, and then you assess them in a completely traditional environment where it's nothing like what they learned.
Right.
So you ask me, I can't even work in this environment anymore.
Right.
I need students to talk to each other, and here they don't talk to each other, they don't face each other. It's like so unrealistic.
Right. So it's almost replicating, how we have
Yeah.
the gap between teacher-ed programs and practice.
Right,
stuff like that.
right, yes. So
Right.
we teach them real stuff and what's
Right.
happening, but they assess them.
Right. I mean, an assessment way to think about that is you're only assessing some small set of competencies that go into leading a discussion. And the validity question is whether those actually are a valid representation of what somebody could then do in a real discussion because of these limitations. And I don't think we fully know the answer to that yet. These are the kinds of things that we're actually trying to learn from our pilots, right? So whether we're getting information, given all these limitations, that's valid for making decisions about some set of capabilities.
I know Drew said no more, but I'll ask without asking.
Such control,
Did you try it with experts? Did you try this, like how are experts different? Because I'd be curious if you had something in physics, I would take it and then you compare me to a novice and see if there's any difference in how we interact with those.
Let's bring it on. We can have a
on, yeah.
game. Let's do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've done some of that because we wanted to see how somebody who was an identified expert would perform and what it meant for our rubrics. I mean, this brings up one of the other sort of very soft spots in this. I probably shouldn't end with a soft spot, but one of the big soft spots is that there are very weak theories in the education field about professional progression. So we talk about novices and experts like we actually know what characterizes novices and experts at different stages of development, and what would count as a reasonable bar for a just started novice. To be honest with you, I don't feel like we're exactly making it up. We're consulting a lot of people, but it's a real question mark whether our standard for just started novice is the right one. And what the progression would look like towards expertise. I think we're better at the expert part, but even the expert part. Yeah. Often our standards for expert practice, you go look for that in classrooms, it's awfully hard to find.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of issues around this sort of progression.
Okay, thank you very much.